Shortly after midnight on the 26th of September, 1983, a computer in a bunker outside Moscow told the Soviet Union that America had just fired a nuclear missile at it, and attached to that warning the highest confidence rating it was built to express. The officer on duty had roughly half an hour before impact and about 5 minutes to decide whether the most trusted machine in the country was lying to him. He decided it was, and said so out loud, with no evidence at all. The first report described a single intercontinental ballistic missile launched from the United States. Within minutes, the count climbed. 2, 3, 4, 5. Each new line arrived with exactly the same machine certainty as the last, and each one made the situation harder to dismiss, because a malfunction that repeats itself 5 times in sequence stops looking like a malfunction. The siren was audible throughout the facility. Everyone on shift that night heard it, and everyone understood what it meant. Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov could not launch anything. That is the first thing the legend usually gets wrong. He sat at the receiving end of the satellite network, and his entire function was to interpret what the satellites claimed and pass that interpretation upward. The weapons were elsewhere, under other hands, behind other codes. What he controlled was not a trigger. It was a sentence, and the sentence would either say confirmed or would say malfunction. He picked up the line to the duty officer at Air Defense Headquarters and reported that the system was giving a false alarm. Then he sat in a room full of alarms with nothing left to do. Either the ground radars would eventually see warheads climbing over the horizon, or they would see nothing at all, and the difference between those two outcomes was about 20 minutes of silence he had to sit through. 1983 was the year both sides briefly stopped treating nuclear war as theory. In March, Reagan called the Soviet Union an evil empire, then announced a missile defense program that Moscow read as preparation for striking first without fear of reply. By November, American Pershing II missiles would be arriving in West Germany, cutting the warning time on some Soviet targets from roughly 30 minutes to well under 10. 10 minutes is not enough time to think. It is barely enough to answer a telephone. Yuri Andropov, who had run the KGB before running the country, had already ordered his intelligence services to hunt for evidence of an American surprise attack. The operation was called Ryan. Officers abroad were told to report indicators, and the indicators included things like blood bank activity and lights burning late in government buildings. It was an intelligence system designed to find one specific answer, which meant that in practice it kept finding it, month after month, in ordinary things. 3 weeks before the false alarm, on the 1st of September, a Soviet interceptor shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007 after it strayed into Soviet airspace. 269 people died, among them a sitting American congressman. Moscow first denied it, then justified it. The world called it murder. Soviet Air Defense, the same branch that operated the early warning satellites, spent that month humiliated, defensive, and under enormous pressure never to be caught unprepared again. So the alarm did not arrive into a comm system. It arrived into an organization that had been instructed for 2 years to expect precisely this, staffed by people who had just been publicly shamed for a failure of vigilance. Every institutional incentive in that bunker pointed toward believing the scream. Petrov said afterwards that he had never seriously imagined facing the situation. Almost nobody in that chain had. That is what made the machine's confidence so dangerous. The system was called Oko, Russian for eye. It was a constellation of satellites in long, looping Molniya orbits, and it worked on a clever principle. Rather than staring straight down at the American missile fields, where a rocket plume would have to be picked out against bright, cluttered ground, the satellites looked sideways across the edge of the Earth. A launch would then appear as a bright column rising against the blackness of space, unmistakable and clean. The design was elegant, and it had a blind spot nobody had modeled. Late September sits near the autumn equinox. That night, the geometry lined up almost perfectly. The sun low behind a bank of high-altitude cloud, the satellite's orbital path, and the American missile fields all in one line. Sunlight glancing off the tops of those clouds produced a bright, rising signature. The software looked at it and reported a launch. Then another. Then another. Doctrine required a second source. The ground-based radars were supposed to confirm whatever the satellites claimed, and they reported nothing. But that silence proved less than it seemed, because those radars physically cannot see a missile until it climbs above the horizon. For the first critical minutes of a genuine attack, they would also report nothing. Petrov was being asked to distinguish a false alarm from a real one using a sensor that was blind either way. What he did have was unusual knowledge. Petrov was an engineer who had worked on the programs behind the system he was now monitoring. He knew how recently it had been rushed into service, how thin its testing had been, and how much of its apparent certainty was arithmetic rather than evidence. Petrov was born in Vladivostok in 1939, the son of a wartime fighter pilot, and he came up through the technical side of the service rather than the command side. That distinction mattered more than anything else that night. A career commander is trained to act on the warning he is given. An engineer is trained to ask whether the instrument is lying. The Soviet response depended on which of those two habits happened to be sitting in the chair. His reasoning was strategic, not mystical. 5 missiles is not how anyone starts a nuclear war. A G5 is a rounding error. It leaves the enemy's arsenal intact and invites annihilation in return. No general on either side would have signed off on it. The scenario on his screen was militarily incoherent. That is the reasoning. It is not the same as certainty. Accounts of a night differ in their details, including exactly what he said and when, and Petrov himself was consistently unromantic about it in later interviews. He described the odds as close to even. He described the physical sensation of not being able to stand up. He never claimed to have known. He claimed only to have judged, which is a much smaller and much harder thing. Then came the waiting, which is the part no dramatization captures, because nothing happens in it. 20-odd minutes in a bunker full of noise, watching for radar returns that would mean he had just condemned his country by keeping quiet. They never came. The tracks on the screens decayed into nothing. The satellites had been looking at weather. The system had been perfectly confident, and it had been perfectly, catastrophically wrong. Here the story needs correcting, because the version that spread is more flattering than the truth and less interesting than it. In the popular telling, one man's hesitation stood between the world and annihilation. It did not. Petrov held no launch authority, and the Soviet Union in 1983 had no automated pipeline running from a satellite alarm to a missile leaving its silo. Something much slower and far more bureaucratic sat in between the two. The analyst Pavel Podvig, who has spent decades documenting Soviet nuclear forces, makes the case directly. Soviet doctrine in this period was built around absorbing an attack, surviving it, and only then retaliating. That posture required evidence of actual nuclear detonations on Soviet soil, not satellite warnings. Geography and command structure made anything faster impractical. A single alarm, unconfirmed by radar, was not a mechanism that could have ended the world by itself. Had Petrov reported an attack, the warning would have climbed through the early warning command, then the air defense forces, then the general staff, And the most that leadership could plausibly have issued at that stage was a preliminary alert. At every level, someone would have asked why the ground radar saw nothing, and why the United States had allegedly opened a world war with 5 missiles. In all likelihood, the error would have been caught. In all likelihood. That qualifies the whole problem. The nuclear analyst Bruce Blair called it the closest the world came to accidental nuclear war, and the reason is context, not mechanism. 6 weeks later, NATO ran Able Archer 83, an exercise so realistic that Soviet intelligence, still running Ryan, treated it as possible cover for a genuine attack. Declassified assessments suggest Moscow's alarm that November was real. Safeguards work until they meet a leadership that has already decided. Petrov was told there would be a reward. There is not. Instead, he was reprimanded, formally, for improper paperwork, because in the middle of the incident he had failed to keep the combat log up to date. He was moved to a less sensitive post, took early retirement the following year, and suffered breakdown. He explained the logic himself later. Honoring him would have meant admitting the satellite system had failed, which would have meant punishing the scientists who built it. So it stayed buried, not classified out of grand secrecy, so much as simply inconvenient, a night that made important people look careless. It surfaced only in 1998, 15 years later, when General Yuri Votintsev, who had commanded the missile defense units and had personally debriefed Petrov, published his account of what happened. By then, the state whose destruction the machine had nearly triggered no longer existed, and neither did the career it had quietly ruined. The recognition that followed came from abroad and came late. A World Citizen Award in 2004, another presented at the United Nations in 2006, a German Media Award in 2012, the Dresden Peace Prize in 2013. He lived in a flat in Fryazino, outside Moscow, on a modest pension. His wife, Raisa, had died of cancer in 1997. Interviewers kept calling him a hero, and he kept refusing the word, insisting he had simply been doing his job. He died on the 19th of May, 2017, of pneumonia, aged 77. Nobody announced it. The world found out 4 months later, only because a German admirer rang to wish him a happy birthday, and his son answered the phone. The machine that night had been absolutely certain and absolutely wrong. The man had been unsure and right. Every warning system built since has been made faster, which means the room left for a man who is unsure keeps getting smaller.